CEO dares black intern to fix the impossible engine. The roar stuns the room. The silence in the grand hall of Woods Aerospace wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that had a weight to it, pressing down on everyone's shoulders like a physical thing. 200 investors sat in their leather seats, watches gleaming under the chandeliers, waiting for the moment that would change aviation forever. At the center of the stage, bathed in spotlights, sat the Apex 7, a masterpiece of engineering, all chrome and precision, worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And it wouldn't start. Douglas Woods stood beside the silent engine, his jaw tight, his smile frozen in place like ice that was starting to crack. He was a man who'd built an empire on other people's brilliance, though he'd never admit that out loud. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, he gestured to his chief engineer with a sharp flick of his wrist. The engineer, a nervous man with sweat beading on his forehead, pressed buttons, adjusted settings, whispered urgently into his headset. Nothing. The engine sat there like a monument to failure, cold and dead and utterly silent. In the corner of that vast room, holding a tray of untouched lattes that had long since gone lukewarm, stood Tammy Brown. "Hi, and welcome to Lumi's Love Library. This is me, quietly putting my writing out into the world for the first time. I'm 25. I love stories, and I believe words still matter, even when you're not sure who's listening yet. If you're here, even by accident, thank you for giving this story a chance. Let's continue." She was 20 years old, dark-skinned and quiet, the kind of person who'd learned early that being invisible was sometimes the safest way to survive. She wore the standard intern uniform, black slacks, white shirt, a name tag that no one ever bothered to read. For 6 months, she'd been filing papers, fetching coffee, and watching engineers fumble through problems she could solve in her sleep. She'd learned to keep her mouth shut, to nod and smile and disappear into the background. That's what her mother had taught her. Stay small, stay safe. Don't let them see how bright you shine, because they'll only try to dim you. But Tammy couldn't help herself. Even from across the room, she could hear it. Or rather, she could hear what was wrong. The engine had a rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that was just slightly off. Her mother had taught her that too. Listen first. An engine will tell you what it needs if you know how to hear it. Douglas Woods's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. Apparently, even genius has its technical difficulties." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. His eyes swept the room, looking for somewhere to redirect the embarrassment, and they landed on Tammy. His smile sharpened. It wasn't a kind smile. "You there," he called out, pointing directly at her. "Coffee girl, since you seem so fascinated by what's happening up here, why don't you come take a look?" The room went even quieter if that was possible. Heads turned. Tammy felt 200 pairs of eyes land on her like searchlights. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Sir, I don't think—" one of the engineers started to say. "No, no, I insist," Woods interrupted, his voice dripping with mock generosity. "She's been lurking around the labs for months now. Maybe she's picked something up. Come on, sweetheart, show us that innate rhythm you people are so famous for." The words hit like a slap. You people. She heard the whispers, saw the smirks. This wasn't an invitation. It was a sacrifice. He was throwing her to the wolves to save himself, to turn his failure into her humiliation. Tammy's hands trembled as she set down the tray. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to apologize, to disappear. That's what her mother would have done. After years of being beaten down by men just like Douglas Woods, Linda Evans had learned to make herself small, to swallow her brilliance and pretend it didn't exist. But something else stirred in Tammy's chest, something that felt like her mother's voice, younger and fiercer, from before the world had broken her spirit. "Don't you dare let them win." She walked toward the stage. Each step felt like miles. The investors watched her like she was some kind of curiosity, a sideshow. The engineers stepped back, making room, their expressions a mix of pity and barely concealed contempt. Douglas Woods stood with his arms crossed, that cruel smile still playing on his lips. Tammy stopped in front of the Apex 7. Up close, it was even more impressive, a thing of beauty, all its components working in perfect theoretical harmony. Except they weren't working. Not yet. She closed her eyes and listened. Really listened. Past the murmurs of the crowd, past the pounding of her own heart, to the engine itself. There, she heard it. A tiny irregularity in the cooling system. A thermal expansion issue that no one had accounted for because they'd been so focused on the fancy new components that they'd forgotten the basics. Her mother had designed something similar 20 years ago. Tammy had seen the blueprints in their attic, yellowed with age, covered in Linda's precise handwriting. She'd memorized every detail. Without asking permission, Tammy reached for a wrench from the nearby tool cart. It was heavy in her hands, cold steel that felt more real than anything else in this room full of pretense. She knelt beside the engine, ignoring her reflection in its polished surface, and located the thermal regulator. 3 turns counterclockwise. Then she moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the interface, bypassing the safety protocol that was strangling the system. "What do you think you're doing?" One of the engineers sputtered. "You can't just—" "Let her finish," Wood said, and his voice had gone soft and dangerous. He was so certain she would fail. He wanted her to fail. It would be a story he could tell for years, about the little coffee girl who'd tried to play engineer. Tammy's hands were steady now. She made one final adjustment, a tiny recalibration of the pressure valve that everyone else had overlooked. Then she stood, stepped back, and pressed the ignition sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched so thin it felt like it might shatter. And then the Apex 7 roared to life. It wasn't just a start. It was a symphony. The engine didn't just run. It sang, a deep, powerful thrumming that filled the hall like thunder. The needles on every gauge jumped to perfect levels. The turbines spun in flawless synchronization. It was everything Douglas Woods had promised and more, except it wasn't his genius that had made it happen. It was hers. The room erupted. Investors jumped to their feet, applauding, shouting questions. The engineers stared at the engine, then at Tammy, their faces pale with shock. And Douglas Woods. For just a second, his mask slipped. She saw something flicker in his eyes. Not gratitude. Fear. He recovered quickly, that practiced smile sliding back into place. "Well," he said, his voice booming over the noise. "Isn't that something? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of Woods Aerospace, where even our interns are prodigies." The crowd laughed, eating it up. But Tammy wasn't fooled. She'd seen that look. She knew what it meant. She'd just proven herself brilliant in a room full of men who needed her to be ordinary, and in doing so, She'd painted a target on her back that wouldn't wash off. As the celebration continued around her, as Douglas Wood shook hands and accepted congratulations for an achievement that wasn't his, Tammy stood beside the engine she'd brought to life. Its roar filled her ears, powerful and undeniable. It sounded exactly like her mother had once described, like a heartbeat strong enough to shake the world. Tammy didn't go home right away. She sat in her car in the Woods Aerospace parking lot for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the building's lights reflect off the hood. Her phone had buzzed 17 times, texts from people who'd never spoken to her before, suddenly wanting to congratulate her, to ask her questions, to be her friend now that she'd proven she was worth noticing. She turned the phone face down and drove. The house was small, tucked into a neighborhood that had seen better days but still held onto its dignity. The porch light was on. It was always on when Tammy worked late, her mother's way of saying she was waiting, that someone was always waiting for her to come home. Linda Evans sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, reading glasses perched on her nose. A crossword puzzle half finished in front of her. She was 53, but looked older, the kind of aging that came from carrying weight that wasn't visible. When Tammy walked in, Linda looked up, and something in her daughter's face made her set down her pen. "Baby," she said quietly. "What happened?" Tammy pulled out her phone, scrolled to the photo she'd taken when no one was looking. A close-up of the Apex 7's internal wiring, the configuration she'd fixed, the design that had felt so familiar beneath her hands. She set the phone on the table between them. Linda picked it up. Her hands started to shake. For a long moment, she said nothing. She just stared at that image, her eyes moving over every component, every connection, like she was reading a language only she could understand. Then her breath caught, a small sound that was almost a gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's mine." "I know," Tammy said. Linda's finger traced the screen, following a specific junction where 3 wires met. "This thermal regulator placement, this exact configuration. I designed this in 1999. I told Douglas Woods himself, that the standard placement would cause expansion issues under sustained pressure. He laughed at me, called it overthinking." Her voice cracked. "He said I was trying to complicate things that didn't need complicating, that maybe engineering wasn't really my strength." Tammy pulled out a chair and sat down across from her mother. She'd heard pieces of this story over the years, fragments Linda had shared during late-night conversations or moments when the past bled through into the present. But she'd never heard it all. Her mother had always changed the subject, turned away, built walls around the memories that hurt too much to touch. "They fired me for pushing it," Linda continued, her eyes still fixed on the phone. "Said I was being difficult, insubordinate, that I didn't understand my place in the team." She set the phone down carefully, like it might break. 6 months later, Douglas unveiled a revolutionary new engine design at a press conference. I saw the photos in the trade magazines. It was my work, every single detail. But my name was nowhere. "He stole it," Tammy said. "It wasn't a question. He stole all of it." Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. "The thermal system, the pressure calibrations, even the diagnostic protocol. 20 years of his empire built on work he took from me and engineers like me. People who didn't have the power to fight back." She looked up at her daughter, and her eyes were bright with tears that refused to fall. "And today, they almost made you fix his mistake in front of everyone." "I did fix it," Tammy said. "Mama," The engine failed because they ignored your design. They went back to the standard placement and it failed exactly the way you said it would. When I corrected it, when I moved the regulator to where you originally put it, it worked perfectly. Something shifted in Linda's expression. The pain was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like pride, mixed with fear. "Tammy," she said carefully, "what are you planning to do?" Tammy reached across the table and took her mother's hand. It felt small and worn, marked by years of working jobs that were beneath her just to pay the bills, just to survive after Woods had blacklisted her from every aerospace firm in the country. "I'm going to prove it," Tammy said. "Everything he took from you. I'm going to prove it all." Linda squeezed her daughter's hand so tight it almost hurt. "Baby, he'll destroy you, just like he destroyed me." "No," Tammy said, and her voice was steady, certain. "He won't. Because this time, he won't see it coming until it's too late." The email came at 7 in the morning, marked urgent. Douglas Woods' name in bold at the top. Tammy read it twice, standing in her kitchen with coffee growing cold in her hand, trying to understand what she was seeing. "Effective immediately, you are promoted to Junior Assistant Engineer. Report to room 247 at 9 a.m. to receive your assignment. Congratulations on your initiative and problem-solving skills." Her mother, reading over her shoulder, went very still. "He's keeping you close," Linda said quietly. "That's what he does. He finds people who are too smart to ignore and too young to know better. And he keeps them where he can watch them, where he can take what they create and call it his own." Tammy turned to face her. "You think it's a trap?" "I know it's a trap, baby. I've seen this play before. I lived it." Linda's hands were wrapped around her own coffee cup like she was trying to draw warmth from it. "You go in there thinking it's your big break, your chance to prove yourself. And every idea you have, every solution you find, it goes into a report with his name on it. By the time you realize what's happening, he owns everything you've created, and you can't prove any of it was yours." But Tammy went anyway, because she had to see it, had to know. Room 247 was on the second floor, tucked into a corner that didn't get much foot traffic. When Tammy pushed open the door, she found a space that was barely an office, more like a closet someone had shoved a desk into. There was a small window that looked out onto the parking lot, a filing cabinet that had seen better decades, and walls that still had the faint outlines of removed shelving brackets. She stood in the doorway, something cold settling in her chest. The filing cabinet had a dented corner. The window had a crack in the lower left pane that someone had covered with tape yellowed by age. And on the wall behind, where the desk now sat, there were still holes from something that had been mounted there years ago. Small, evenly spaced holes that could have held a bulletin board or a set of shelves. Tammy pulled out her phone and called her mother. "What was your office number?" she asked when Linda picked up. "When you worked here. What was your office number?" There was a pause. 247, Linda said, and her voice had gone flat. "Why?" Tammy looked around the space, her space now apparently, and felt something like rage mixed with grief settle into her bones. They'd given her mother's office back to her. Not as an honor, as an insult, as a way of saying, "This is where you belong, in the forgotten corner where we put the woman we erased." "He gave me your old office," Tammy said. She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. "Get out of there, Tammy, right now. Don't unpack. Don't sit down. Don't—" "No." Tammy set her bag on the desk. "I'm staying." "Baby, please." Mama, listen to me. Tammy walked to the window, looked out at the sprawling campus of Woods Aerospace, all glass and steel built on stolen dreams. He thinks he's being clever. He thinks he's putting me in a box, keeping me contained in the same space where he contained you, but he made a mistake. What mistake? He thinks I don't know the history. He thinks I don't know this was your office, that I won't recognize what he's doing. Tammy pressed her hand against the wall, feeling the cool plaster beneath her palm. But I do know, and now I'm going to use it. Douglas Woods appeared in her doorway an hour later, all false warmth and calculated smiles. He leaned against the frame like he owned the space, which, technically, he did. "Settling in?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Tammy said, keeping her voice level, professional. "Thank you for the opportunity. You earned it with that impressive display yesterday." He stepped inside, looking around the cramped office with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "I like to keep my best people close. Easy collaboration, you know. Open communication." His eyes landed on her, sharp and assessing. "I'm sure you'll have lots of ideas to share. My door is always open." "I appreciate that," Tammy said, and she even smiled. "I'm looking forward to contributing to the team." After he left, she sat at the desk, her mother's desk, and opened her laptop. She had work to do, real work. The kind that Douglas Woods would never see coming because he was too busy congratulating himself on a trap he thought he'd already sprung. Her mother had fallen into this trap 20 years ago because she'd been alone, isolated, with no proof and no voice loud enough to be heard. But Tammy wasn't alone. She had her mother's memories, her mother's blueprints, and her mother's fire burning in her chest. And this time, she knew exactly what game was being played. This time, she was going to win. It happened 3 weeks into her new position, during a late Thursday night when most of the building had emptied out, and Tammy was alone with the hum of servers and the blue glow of her monitor. She'd been doing routine database maintenance, one of the tedious tasks they assigned to junior staff, when she noticed something odd. A folder buried deep in the archived files, 3 layers down in directories that hadn't been accessed in years. The folder name made her breath catch. Project Evans, her mother's maiden name. The name she'd used professionally before she married Tammy's father, before everything fell apart. Tammy's hands hovered over the keyboard. This could be nothing. Old personnel files, maybe. Performance reviews from 2 decades ago. But the folder was encrypted, locked behind a security protocol that seemed excessive for something innocent. She tried her standard credentials. Access denied. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, her mind racing. Why would Douglas Woods keep encrypted files with her mother's name on them? Why lock them away like secrets that needed guarding? Then she remembered something her mother had told her once, late at night over wine and old wounds. Linda had been meticulous about security, almost paranoid about it. She'd used the same password for everything at work, a combination so specific to her that no one else would guess it. Tammy's fingers moved across the keyboard, typing slowly, carefully. Her mother's birthday, her grandmother's initials, the year Linda graduated from MIT. The folder opened. Inside were dozens of files. Blueprints, patent applications, internal memos, and video files. Grainy, dated footage that looked like it had been pulled from old security cameras. Tammy opened the first document. It was a patent application dated March 1999, filed under Linda Evans' name. The thermal regulation system for high-performance aerospace engines, the same system currently powering the Apex 7 and half a dozen other Woods Aerospace products. Except this version showed Linda as the inventor, with detailed notes in her handwriting, timestamps proving she'd developed it months before Woods unveiled his revolutionary design. The second file was an internal memo from Douglas Woods to his legal team. Tammy read it twice, her jaw tightening with each word. Evans has become a liability. Her insistence on proper credit is hampering team morale and creating documentation issues. Recommend immediate termination following the Q2 demonstration. If the demo fails, we have cause. If it succeeds, we have leverage. If the demo fails... Tammy opened one of the video files. It was dated April 15, 1999, stamped with a time code showing 11:47 p.m. The footage showed the engineering lab, empty except for one figure moving near the test platform where Linda's prototype engine sat. The figure was tall, male, wearing a Woods Aerospace polo shirt. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but Tammy could see enough. Could see him disconnecting something from the engine's control panel, pocketing a small component, then walking away. The next video was from the following morning. The demonstration. Linda standing beside her engine, confident and brilliant, explaining her design to a room full of board members and investors. Douglas Woods watching from the side, arms crossed, expression neutral. And then the failure. The engine sputtering, dying, refusing to start. Linda's face crumbling as she tried desperately to diagnose the problem, her hand shaking as the investors whispered and the board members frowned. Woods stepping forward, all concern and sympathy, suggesting that perhaps the design wasn't as sound as Linda had claimed, that perhaps she'd been working beyond her depth. Tammy found the termination letter 3 files later. Linda Evans was being let go due to inability to deliver on promised results and fundamental design flaws that endangered company resources. There was a severance package, insultingly small, contingent on Linda signing over all patents and intellectual property developed during her tenure. Her mother had signed it. Tammy could see the signature, shaky and defeated, dated 2 days after the demonstration. What choice had she had? A single mother with a baby daughter, blacklisted and broken, being offered pennies or nothing at all. 6 months later, Douglas Woods filed for patents on Linda's thermal regulation system, under his name, using her exact specifications. Tammy sat in the glow of her monitor, her mother's stolen legacy spread across the screen like evidence at a crime scene, and felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger she'd felt when Woods first mocked her. This was different. This was rage that had been aged and refined, turned into something harder and more dangerous. He hadn't just stolen her mother's work, he'd destroyed her on purpose, had sabotaged her demonstration, humiliated her publicly, then forced her to sign away everything she'd created just to survive. And he'd built an empire on that theft, had become a billionaire on the back of a woman whose name he'd erased from every record. Tammy copied every file, sent them to 3 separate encrypted cloud accounts, backed them up on 2 different hard drives. Then she closed the folder, cleared her access logs, and sat in the darkness of her office, her mother's office, with her hands perfectly still and her mind working like the engine she understood so well. Calculating, precise, unforgiving. Douglas Woods had created a ghost in his machine 20 years ago when he buried Linda Evans' legacy. Now that ghost had a daughter. and she knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. Kurt Wheeler was exactly the kind of engineer who made Tammy's teeth ache. 52 years old, a gut that strained against his company polo, and the absolute conviction that his engineering degree from 1995 made him an expert on technology he barely understood. He'd been at Woods Aerospace for 18 years, riding the coattails of other people's innovations while collecting promotions like participation trophies. When Tammy developed a new calibration protocol for the Apex 7's fuel efficiency system, something that could improve performance by 12%, she knew what would happen. She'd seen it play out a dozen times in the month since she'd been promoted. A junior engineer would solve a problem, document it carefully, submit it through proper channels, and then someone like Kurt would sweep in, repackage it with fancier language, and present it to Douglas Woods as their own breakthrough. So when Kurt stopped by her office on a Tuesday afternoon, all casual smiles and false camaraderie, Tammy was ready. "Hey, Tammy," he said, leaning against her doorframe like they were old friends. "Heard you've been working on some fuel efficiency improvements. Mind if I take a look at your notes? Just want to make sure it integrates well with the existing systems before we move forward." She knew what he really meant. "Let me steal this before you get credit for it." "Of course," Tammy said, her voice sweet and helpful. She pulled up the documentation on her screen, turned the monitor so he could see. "I've mapped out the entire calibration sequence here. It's pretty straightforward once you understand the underlying logic." Kurt's eyes glazed over as she walked him through the technical details. She could tell he wasn't really listening, wasn't really trying to understand. He was just waiting for her to give him the files so he could slap his name on them. "This is great work," he said in the tone of someone patting a child on the head. "Really great. Why don't you send me everything, and I'll present it at Friday's engineering review. You know how Woods is. He responds better to senior staff. I'll make sure you get mentioned." Mentioned, not credited. Mentioned, like a footnote, like an afterthought. "That would be wonderful," Tammy said, and she sent him the files. What Kurt didn't know, what he couldn't know because he'd never actually bothered to understand the work, was that buried in the calibration code was a logic loop that would trigger after exactly 72 hours of run time. The system would appear to function perfectly, would show all the promised efficiency improvements, would impress everyone with its elegant simplicity. And then, at the 72-hour mark, it would start requesting an authentication code that only Tammy knew how to generate. Without that code, the whole thing would lock up. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would damage anything. Just enough to make it very, very clear that the person presenting the work didn't actually understand how it functioned. Friday's engineering review was held in the main conference room, the one with the long glass table and the view of the facility floor. Douglas Woods sat at the head, his senior team arranged around him like disciples. Tammy sat in the back, her tablet in her lap, her expression attentive and professional. Kurt stood at the presentation screen, clicking through slides that Tammy had created, explaining concepts he'd memorized but didn't truly grasp. He was confident, performative, taking questions from Woods with the easy authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we need," Woods said, nodding approvingly. "Kurt, excellent work. This could save us millions annually." "Thank you, sir," Kurt said, and he didn't even glance in Tammy's direction. "I've always believed that efficiency is about understanding the fundamentals and—" His tablet chimed. then chimed again. The display screen behind him flickered. Kurt frowned, tapping at his device. That's odd. The test system seems to be requesting some kind of verification code. What kind of code? Woods asked, his voice sharpening. I'm not sure. It wasn't in the documentation. Kurt's confidence was starting to crack around the edges. He swiped through screens, his movements becoming more frantic. This shouldn't be happening. The system was running perfectly during the trial runs. Can you fix it? Woods asked. I just need to... Kurt trailed off, staring at his tablet like it had betrayed him. The error message was simple, clear, completely unambiguous. Authentication required. Contact system architect for override code. Tammy waited. Let the silence stretch. Let Kurt fumble and sweat and realize that he had no idea what he was presenting because he'd never actually done the work. Finally, Woods turned to her. Ms. Brown, you assisted with this project, correct? I developed the calibration protocol, yes, sir, Tammy said calmly. Do you know what's causing this error? She stood, walked to the front of the room, took Kurt's tablet from his hands. Her fingers moved across the screen, entering the authentication sequence she'd built into the system. A code derived from her mother's old employee number, a small rebellion hidden in plain sight. The error cleared. The system hummed back to life, all its efficiency improvements restored and functioning perfectly. The authentication requirement is a security feature, Tammy explained, her voice steady and clear. It ensures that only personnel who fully understand the system architecture can make modifications or overrides. It prevents well-intentioned but potentially dangerous tinkering from people who might not grasp the underlying thermal dynamics. The room was silent. Kurt's face had gone red. Woods looked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. How thoughtful, he said. Ms. Brown, perhaps you should walk us through the technical details yourself, since you seem to understand them so thoroughly. Tammy presented her work. Her actual work, in her own words, with her own understanding evident in every explanation. And when she finished, there was no question who had created it. Kurt Wheeler left the meeting early, claiming a sudden illness. Tammy stayed until the end, answering questions, basking in the cold satisfaction of watching the expert exposed as nothing more than a thief with a better title. The first time Tammy brought her mother through the security checkpoint at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, Linda's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her temporary visitor badge. I shouldn't be here, Linda whispered as they walked through the empty corridors, past darkened offices and silent labs. Baby, if they catch us... They won't, Tammy said, squeezing her mother's hand. The night security only checks the main floors. Lab 3 is in the East Wing. No cameras in the work areas because of the proprietary tech. We're invisible. Linda stopped walking when Tammy opened the door to the lab. She stood in the doorway, staring at the space like it was a room from a dream she'd tried to forget. The equipment was newer, shinier, but the layout was almost identical to how it had been 20 years ago. The same long workbenches, the same wall of diagnostic screens, even the same faint smell of machine oil and solder. I used to stand right there, Linda said softly, pointing to a spot near the main testing platform. That's where I built the first prototype. I'd stay until 2, 3 in the morning sometimes. Just me and the engines. They made sense to me in a way people never did. Tammy guided her mother inside, closing the door behind them. On the central platform sat the Omega Drive, the next generation engine that was supposed to revolutionize aerospace propulsion. It was beautiful, all gleaming components and precision engineering. It was also fundamentally flawed in ways that only Tammy had noticed, problems that the senior engineering team was too proud to acknowledge. "I need your help," Tammy said. "The thermal cascade issue in the secondary combustion chamber. I've run the numbers 40 different ways, and I keep hitting the same wall." Linda approached the engine slowly, like she was approaching something sacred. She pulled on a pair of work gloves that Tammy handed her, and for the first time in weeks, her hands were steady. She studied the Omega Drive in silence, her eyes moving over every component, every connection, reading the machine like a language she'd been forbidden to speak. "They made the same mistake again," Linda murmured, almost to herself. "Look here. The pressure differential isn't accounting for sustained high-altitude operation. The cascade will trigger at 30,000 feet, maybe sooner." Her fingers traced a pathway through the components. "We need to redesign the flow architecture, move this regulator here, adjust the intake ratio, and add a buffer system right here." They worked through the night, mother and daughter, shoulder to shoulder, their hands moving in synchronized precision. Linda's knowledge from decades ago merged seamlessly with Tammy's understanding of modern systems. When Tammy hit a problem, Linda would suggest an approach from classical engineering principles that Tammy would then adapt with current technology. When Linda hesitated, unsure if her old method still applied, Tammy would show her how the fundamentals never changed. They just wore different faces. Around 2 a.m., Linda was elbow-deep in the engine's core, recalibrating a valve assembly, when she suddenly stopped and looked at her daughter. "I forgot how much I loved this," she said, and her voice cracked. "I forgot that I was good at it, that I belonged here." Tammy set down her tablet and moved to her mother's side. "You were the best. You are the best. He took this from you, but he couldn't erase what you knew, what you could do." Linda's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I spent 20 years convinced I'd failed. That maybe he was right. That maybe I didn't have what it took." "He was never right," Tammy said fiercely. "He was a thief, and we're taking back what he stole." They worked until dawn started bleeding gray light through the high windows. When they finally stepped back from the Omega Drive, it was transformed. The flaws were corrected, the systems optimized. The engine that the senior team couldn't perfect was now a masterpiece of engineering, built by two women who weren't supposed to be brilliant, who weren't supposed to be there at all. Linda pulled off her work gloves and looked at her hands, scarred from years of menial labor, marked by time and hardship, but still capable of creating something extraordinary. "We should go," Tammy said. "Security shift changes at 6. But Linda lingered for a moment, standing in the lab that had once been her second home, looking at the engine they'd brought to life together. She touched it gently, reverently, the way you might touch something you thought you'd lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered. Though Tammy wasn't sure if her mother was talking to her, or to the engine, or to some version of herself that had been buried for 20 years. They slipped out of the building just as the morning staff started arriving. In the parking lot, with the sun rising over Woods Aerospace, Linda took her daughter's face in both hands. "Whatever happens next," she said, "whatever he tries to do to you, you remember this. Remember that your brilliance doesn't need his permission. It never did." Tammy drove them home through the quiet morning streets, And for the first time since she'd started working at Woods Aerospace, she didn't feel like an imposter or an intruder. She felt like her mother's daughter, and that was more powerful than any title Douglas Woods could ever give her. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Tammy had submitted her perfected Omega Drive specifications to the engineering review board. She'd been careful, meticulous, documenting every modification, every improvement, making sure there was a clear paper trail of her work. She'd thought she was being smart. She hadn't realized that being too smart was exactly the problem. Tammy was at her desk, reviewing thermal stress calculations, when her computer screen went black. Not a normal shutdown, a hard cut, like someone had severed the connection remotely. She tried logging back in. Access denied. She tried her backup credentials. Access denied. Her security badge, sitting on the desk beside her coffee, suddenly flashed red instead of green. Her office phone rang. Internal extension. Security. Ms. Brown, please remain in your office. Someone will be there shortly to escort you. The line went dead before she could ask why. 2 security guards arrived 5 minutes later, their faces professionally blank. Behind them stood Gerald Hutchins from IT, and someone Tammy didn't recognize. A woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase that screamed corporate lawyer. Ms. Brown, the woman said, her voice crisp and cold. I'm Rebecca Stern, Chief Legal Counsel for Woods Aerospace. We need you to come with us. There are some serious allegations that need to be addressed. What allegations? Tammy stood slowly, her mind racing. I haven't done anything wrong. Then you have nothing to worry about, Stern said, in a tone that suggested Tammy had everything to worry about. They walked her through the building, past her colleagues who stared and whispered, past the engineering labs where she'd spent countless hours proving herself, past everything she'd worked for. They took her to a conference room on the executive floor, Douglas Woods' territory, and sat her down in a chair that felt like an interrogation seat. Gerald from IT opened his laptop, turning the screen so Tammy could see. These are access logs from our secure server, specifically from archived files dating back to 1999, files that are classified as confidential company property. Tammy's stomach dropped. Project Evans. They knew. According to these logs, Gerald continued, your credentials were used to access, download, and transmit proprietary historical documents to external cloud storage accounts. Documents containing patent information, internal communications, and other sensitive materials. Tammy started. Corporate espionage is a federal crime, Ms. Brown, Stern interrupted. Theft of trade secrets can result in up to 10 years in prison and fines up to $5 million. The door opened. Douglas Woods walked in, and the expression on his face was one Tammy would remember for the rest of her life. Not anger, not even triumph. Just cold, calculated satisfaction, the look of a man who'd successfully eliminated a threat. This is extremely disappointing, Woods said, his voice heavy with false regret. I gave you an opportunity, promoted you, trusted you with access to our most sensitive projects. And this is how you repay that trust? Those files were about my mother, Tammy said, her voice shaking with anger. About what you did to her. Your mother was a disgruntled former employee who couldn't accept her own limitations, Woods said smoothly. And now you're following in her footsteps, trying to steal proprietary information to, what? Sell to our competitors? Start your own firm with our intellectual property? You stole her work. Tammy stood up, and the security guards moved closer. Everything in those files proves you sabotaged her demonstration, forced her to sign away her patents, built your entire empire on designs she created. Wood smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of someone who'd already won. That's an interesting story. Unfortunately for you, Miss Brown, the law doesn't care about stories. It cares about evidence. And the evidence shows that you illegally accessed confidential files, downloaded proprietary materials, and transmitted them to personal accounts. That's theft. That's espionage. I have proof. You have stolen documents, Stern corrected. Obtained through unauthorized access. Even if they contained what you claim, which they don't, they would be inadmissible. Fruit of the poisoned tree. Tammy's hands clenched into fists. She'd been so careful. She'd documented everything, backed up everything, thought she'd protected herself. But she hadn't considered that the game was rigged from the start, that the man who'd stolen her mother's legacy would have no problem framing the daughter for trying to reclaim it. Security will escort you from the premises, Wood said. Your access has been revoked. Your personal belongings will be shipped to your address. And Ms. Brown? He leaned forward slightly. If you attempt to contact anyone from this company, if you make any public statements about these absurd allegations, if you do anything except disappear quietly, we will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. Do you understand? Tammy looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what her mother must have seen 20 years ago. A man who would destroy anyone who threatened his false empire. A man who held all the power and knew exactly how to wield it. I understand, she said quietly. They walked her out through the main lobby, past the massive portrait of Douglas Woods that hung near the entrance, past the gleaming displays showcasing the Apex 7 and other innovations he'd claimed as his own. Employees stopped and stared. Some looked sympathetic, most looked away. As the security guards escorted her through the front doors, Tammy glanced up. Douglas Wood stood on the second-floor balcony, watching her leave. He raised his hand in a small wave, almost friendly. He thought he'd won. Thought he'd buried the threat just like he'd buried her mother. But as Tammy walked across the parking lot to her car, her company badge deactivated, her career destroyed, her freedom potentially hanging in the balance, she thought about the copies she'd made, the backups of the backups, the encrypted files sent to email accounts Woods didn't know existed, to people he'd never thought to monitor. She'd lost this battle, but the war wasn't over. Not even close. Tammy sat in her mother's kitchen for 3 days, staring at laptop screens and legal documents, trying to find a way forward that didn't end with her in prison. Every lawyer she contacted said the same thing. Without legal access to those files, she had no case. The evidence was poisoned. Woods had made sure of that. On the 4th day, her mother came home from the grocery store and set a paper bag on the counter. She looked at her daughter, still in pajamas, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers, and said, "You know what you have to do." "There's nothing I can do," Tammy said. "He's blocked every legal avenue. If I go public, he'll have me arrested. If I stay quiet, he wins." Linda pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "When I designed the original security system for that building in 1997, I built in a back door, a way to access the facility if the main systems failed. It was standard practice back then. Just good engineering." She paused. Douglas never knew about it. It was in the infrastructure documentation he never bothered to read. And unless they've completely rebuilt the security backbone, which they haven't, because that would cost millions, it's still there. Tammy looked up. Mama, that would be breaking and entering. You're already facing espionage charges, baby. Might as well make them count for something. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Tammy knew this because she'd hacked into Woods's executive assistant's calendar, another skill her mother had taught her during those late-night sessions. The meeting was called to discuss the Omega Drive's final specifications before the big investor presentation. The same specifications Tammy had perfected. The same work that would launch with Douglas Woods's name on it. Linda's back door was a maintenance access panel in the parking garage, connected to a service corridor that the original blueprints showed led directly to the executive floor. At 1:47 p.m., Tammy used her mother's old override code, a sequence of numbers that shouldn't have worked after 20 years but did, and the panel clicked open. She walked through corridors she wasn't supposed to see, past mechanical rooms and server closets, her tablet clutched against her chest. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, loud as an engine, fierce as thunder. The boardroom was exactly where the blueprint said it would be. Through the small window in the service door, Tammy could see them all. The board members in their expensive suits. Douglas Woods at the head of the table, mid-presentation, gesturing to a screen showing the Omega Drive specifications. Her specifications, her mother's innovations, their stolen legacy being paraded as his genius. Tammy pushed open the door and walked in. The room went silent. Douglas Woods froze mid-sentence, his face cycling through shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Security!" he barked, reaching for the phone. "I wouldn't," Tammy said, her voice steady and clear. She raised her tablet. "Because what I'm about to show your board is going to change everything." "Ms. Brown, you are trespassing on private property," Rebecca Stern said, half rising from her seat. "You are in violation of patent law," Tammy interrupted. "Specifically, the illegal appropriation of intellectual property belonging to Linda Evans, filed March 1999, 20 years before Douglas Woods claimed the same designs as his own revolutionary innovations." She connected her tablet to the boardroom's display system. Another trick her mother had taught her, because Linda had designed this room too, had built-in compatibility that Douglas Woods never knew existed. The screen filled with Linda's original patent applications. Dated, stamped, official. The thermal regulation system, the pressure calibration protocols, the cascade prevention architecture. Every innovation that had made Woods Aerospace billions, documented in Linda Evans' handwriting, filed under Linda Evans's name, months before Douglas Woods unveiled them to the world. "This is ridiculous," Woods said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Those documents are authentic," Tammy said, "filed with the U.S. Patent Office. Public record, freely accessible to anyone who knows where to look." She advanced to the next screen. "Here's the internal memo where you plan to sabotage my mother's demonstration. Here's the security footage of you removing a critical component from her engine the night before her final presentation. Here's the termination letter where you forced her to sign away her life's work for $75,000. The board members were leaning forward now, staring at the screen. One of them, a woman named Patricia Sherwin, who Tammy recognized from the financial journals, picked up her phone and started taking notes. "And here," Tammy said, pulling up the final file, "is the Omega Drive, the specifications your engineering team couldn't solve, The specifications I perfected, using my mother's methods, building on my mother's foundation. Because unlike you, Mr. Woods, I actually understand the work. I didn't steal it. I inherited it. Douglas Woods stood up, his face red. This is corporate espionage. She accessed confidential files illegally. Nothing she's showing you is admissible. The patent applications are public record, Patricia Sherwin said quietly. The security footage is time-stamped and authenticated. And the memo. She looked at Woods with an expression that could have frozen fire. The memo is on company letterhead, with your signature, discussing sabotage of an employee. This is a setup, Woods said. Her mother was, they're trying to, but his words were falling apart, crumbling like a structure built on a foundation of lies. Tammy looked at him, this man who'd stolen her mother's dreams, who'd tried to steal hers, who'd thought he could win simply because he'd always won before. And she smiled. I'm not invisible anymore, she said. And neither is my mother. The board members were talking now. Urgent whispers that filled the room like the roar of an engine finally coming to life. Patricia Sherwin was already making calls. Others were pulling up documents on their own tablets, fact-checking, verifying. Security arrived 2 minutes later, but they didn't escort Tammy out. They escorted Douglas Woods to his office to collect his belongings. And Tammy stood in the boardroom, the room her mother had designed but never been allowed to enter, and watched everything change. The board reconvened 3 days later in Lab 1, the largest testing facility on campus. This time, there were no investors, no press, no champagne, just 12 board members, a team of independent engineers they'd hired to verify everything, and 2 engines sitting side by side on testing platforms. On the left was the Apex 7 as Douglas Woods had built it, or rather, as he'd poorly copied from Linda Evans' stolen designs, cutting corners and simplifying systems he didn't fully understand in the name of faster production and higher profit margins. On the right was Tammy's Omega Drive, built to her mother's original specifications, perfected through those secret midnight sessions, carrying 20 years of refinement that should have happened decades ago. Tammy stood between them, wearing a lab coat that finally felt like it belonged to her mother sitting in the observation gallery above. Linda had been invited. More than invited, actually. Patricia Sherwin had personally called to apologize for the company's treatment of her and to request her presence as a technical consultant. The words technical consultant had made Linda cry, though she'd tried to hide it. Ms. Brown, Patricia Sherwin said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Please proceed with your demonstration. Tammy walked to the Apex 7 first, the engine that had made Douglas Woods a billionaire, the engine that had started this whole journey when it failed during that humiliating gala. She powered it up using the standard protocols, watched the diagnostic screens light up with normal readings. The Apex 7 performs well under standard conditions, Tammy explained, her voice calm and professional. Initial startup is smooth, fuel efficiency is good. It meets all the basic specifications. She adjusted several parameters, increasing the stress levels. But when we simulate sustained high-altitude operation, the conditions these engines will actually face in long-distance flight, we start to see problems. The temperature gauges began climbing, slowly at first, then faster. The thermal regulation system was struggling, trying to compensate, but it was fighting a losing battle against physics and poor design. The issue is fundamental, Tammy continued. Mr. Wood simplified my mother's original thermal cascade prevention system. He removed what he called redundant components to cut manufacturing costs by 8%. But those components weren't redundant, they were critical safety features. The Apex 7's temperature was in the red zone now. Warning lights flashed across the diagnostic panels. One of the independent engineers moved closer, his expression alarmed. At 32,000 feet under sustained operation, the Apex 7's core temperature exceeds safe limits, Tammy said. The thermal cascade my mother predicted in 1999 begins. The engine doesn't fail immediately. That would almost be safer. Instead, it degrades slowly, compromising structural integrity while still appearing functional on basic diagnostics. She powered down the Apex 7 before it could damage itself further. The engine sat there, cooling, radiating heat like a fever it couldn't shake. Then Tammy turned to the Omega drive. "This is my mother's original design," she said quietly. Not the version Douglas Woods stole and gutted. The complete system, exactly as she intended it. She initiated the startup sequence. The Omega drive came to life with a sound that was different from the Apex 7, deeper, more resonant, like the difference between a scream and a song. Tammy ran it through the same stress tests, the same high-altitude simulations, pushing it even harder than she'd pushed Woods's version. The temperature gauges remained stable. Perfect. The thermal regulation system worked in flawless harmony, each component supporting the others in a dance of engineering precision that Linda had choreographed 2 decades ago. "This is what genius looks like when it's not compromised," Tammy said, "when it's not stolen and simplified and stripped down for profit. My mother designed the system to be safe, to protect lives. Douglas Woods turned it into something dangerous because he didn't understand what he'd taken." Patricia Sherwin was writing notes furiously. The other board members were staring at the 2 engines, at the stark difference in their performance, at the undeniable evidence of what had been lost when they'd chosen greed over genuine innovation. "How many Apex 7 engines are currently in service?" one of the board members asked, his voice tight. 43, another answered, "in commercial and military applications." The implications hung in the air like smoke. 43 engines that could fail at altitude. 43 potential disasters. Lives at risk because Douglas Woods had valued his profit margins over people's safety. "We need to ground them immediately," Patricia Sherwin said. "Issue a recall. Retrofit every single one with Miss Sakar's Evans' complete thermal system." "That will cost hundreds of millions," someone protested. "And lawsuits from crashes will cost billions," Sherwin shot back, "along with our reputation and quite possibly our business licenses." She looked at Tammy. "How long would it take to retrofit the existing engines?" Tammy glanced up at her mother in the observation gallery. Linda nodded, a small gesture of encouragement and pride. "With the right team and my mother's guidance," Tammy said, "we could have a retrofit protocol ready in 6 weeks. Full implementation in 6 months." "Then that's what we'll do." Sherwin turned to face the other board members. "All in favor of immediately implementing the Evans thermal system across all our engine platforms and issuing a full recall of the Apex 7 pending safety retrofits?" Every hand went up. In the observation gallery, Linda Evans watched her daughter stand beside the engine that proved her genius had been right all along. Watched the board members treat Tammy with the respect Linda herself had been denied. Watched her life's work finally being recognized for what it truly was. She pressed her hand against the glass, and Tammy looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, across the years, across all the pain and theft and injustice. And Linda smiled, because the engine's true voice wasn't the roar of power or the silence of failure. It was the sound of vindication, and it echoed through every corner of Woods Aerospace like a truth that could no longer be ignored. The vote to remove Douglas Woods as CEO was unanimous. It happened in a closed session on a gray Thursday morning, with lawyers present and severance packages negotiated in terse, professional language that couldn't quite hide the disgrace underneath. Woods left through a side entrance, no press conference, no farewell gala, just a man carrying a box of personal items to a car that was no longer company-owned. He didn't look back. Patricia Sherwin was named interim CEO while the board conducted a search for permanent leadership. Her first official act was to issue a public statement acknowledging that Linda Evans had been the original architect of the thermal regulation technology that had powered Woods Aerospace for 2 decades, and that the company's failure to credit her had been a grave injustice that we are committed to correcting. Her second act was to offer Linda Evans a position as Chief Engineering Advisor, with a salary that made up for some, though never all, of what had been stolen from her. Her third act was to promote Tammy Brown to lead engineer, making her the youngest person ever to hold that title in the company's history. The rebranding took 6 months. Woods Aerospace became Evans Aerospace in a ceremony that felt less like a corporate event and more like a reckoning. The old portraits came down. The lobby displays were redesigned, and on the main building's facade, where Douglas Woods's name had been carved in stone, workers carefully removed each letter and replaced them with new ones that spelled out a different legacy. But the moment that mattered most to Tammy happened on a cold morning in February in Hangar 7, with just her mother beside her and a plane waiting on the tarmac. It was a retrofitted commercial aircraft, one of the 43 that had been grounded and rebuilt with Linda's complete thermal system. The engines gleamed in the winter sun, perfect and whole, carrying the technology that should have revolutionized aviation 20 years earlier, but was finally getting its chance now. On the engine cowling, in letters that were small but unmistakable, were the words, Evans Thermal Regulation System, Original Design by Linda Evans, 1999. Linda stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Tammy wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders and held her while she cried. Not tears of sadness this time, but of relief so profound it felt like a physical release. "They put my name on it," Linda whispered. "After all these years, they put my name on it." "It was always yours," Tammy said. "We just made sure everyone knew it." The pilot, a woman named Sarah Sherwin, Patricia's daughter, who'd insisted on being the first to test the retrofitted system, gave them a thumbs up from the cockpit. The engines started with that deep, resonant hum that Tammy had come to recognize as the sound of something built right, built with care, built with the kind of genius that couldn't be faked or stolen. The plane taxied down the runway, gathering speed, and then lifted into the air with a grace that took Tammy's breath away. She watched it climb, watched it bank against the winter sky, watched it perform maneuvers that would have been dangerous with Wood's compromised version, but were perfectly safe now. Linda grabbed her daughter's hand and squeezed it so tight it almost hurt. "Do you remember when you were little?" Linda said, her voice shaky with emotion. "And you asked me why I didn't work with airplanes anymore? And I told you that sometimes dreams don't work out the way we plan? I remember, Tammy said. I was wrong. Linda looked at her daughter, and her eyes were bright with something that looked like hope reborn. Dreams don't always work out the way we plan. Sometimes they work out better. Sometimes they come back stronger because someone who loves us fights for them when we can't fight anymore. In the months that followed, Evans Aerospace would become an industry leader not despite the scandal, but because of how they'd handled it. The company's commitment to safety over profit, to truth over convenience, to crediting the people who actually did the work. It all became part of their brand, their identity, their promise to do better than the men who'd come before. Tammy and Linda worked side by side, perfecting new designs, mentoring young engineers, building a culture where brilliance was recognized regardless of who possessed it. They hired more women, more people of color, more voices that had been shut out of rooms where decisions were made and innovations were born. And every time a plane took off bearing the Evans name, every time an engine roared to life using Linda's designs, it was a reminder that some legacies couldn't be stolen. They could be suppressed, buried, denied for years or even decades. But truth had a way of surviving. It waited in blueprints hidden in attics. It lived in daughters who refused to stay invisible. It echoed in the sound of engines that finally ran the way they were always meant to. 6 months after the rebranding, Tammy stood in the office that used to be Douglas Wood's, now hers, though she'd redecorated it completely, removing every trace of the man who'd built an empire on theft. On her desk was a framed photo of her mother from 1999, young and brilliant and full of dreams that had been stolen but not destroyed. Beside it was a blueprint, signed by both of them. The Evans Legacy Project, Next Generation Propulsion Systems. Through her window, Tammy could see the hangar where new engines were being built, where the next generation of aerospace technology was taking shape. She could hear the distant roar of a test engine firing up, that sound that used to be a dare, a mockery, a challenge meant to humiliate. Now it was something else entirely. Now it was the sound of her mother's voice, finally heard. Now it was the sound of justice, hard-won and undeniable. Now it was the sound of a legacy reclaimed, burning bright enough to light the way for everyone who came after. The roar of the engine filled the air like a promise kept, like a story finally told right, like the echo of brilliance that would never again be silenced. And Tammy smiled, because she knew her mother could hear it too. If you enjoyed this story, you're welcome to stay. Subscribe to Lumi's Love Library for new stories every day. And if you're not ready to leave yet, there's another story waiting for you in the playlist on your screen right now.